Welcome to Patchwork Revival. If you are a new listener of the podcast, thank you so much for being here. I hope some of you are joining us today as part of our two-part episode. Today's episode is going to be a really broad timeline sort of overview of the history of quilting in America, quilting through the different eras in the United States. I partnered with my friend Megan of Quilt Scouts, who has the Quilt Scouts podcast, and we decided to split this into a two-part episode so that I could invite my listeners to check out the Quilt Scouts podcast, and hopefully some of her listeners can check out the Patchwork Revival podcast. As always, the podcast is here to be an open community, a welcoming place for quilters of all ages, all styles, all backgrounds to come together, to learn a little bit about the history of quilting, to reclaim tradition in a modern world, and to have a lot of fun doing it. So stick around. Thanks for being here. Don't forget, for a two-part episode, part one is going to be hosted here on the Patchwork Revival podcast, and part two will be hosted on the Quilt Scouts podcast, hosted by my friend Megan of Quilt Scouts. I will link part two to her podcast in the show notes so that it's going to be really easy for you to just pop over there and catch part two. Without further ado, let's jump into this week's special two-part episode. Hey y'all, I'm Emily, an almost lifelong quilter with a lot of stories to tell. I have loved quilts and talking about them for as long as I can remember, and I'm here to celebrate the tradition of quilting with you. From family heirlooms to thrift store finds, every quilt holds a piece of history and a little piece of a quilter's heart. Join me every other week to get back to your quilting roots. We'll celebrate quilts and the real people who made them, learn a little bit about the history of quilting, and have lots of fun exploring ways to reclaim tradition in a modern world. I'm so glad you're joining me this week here at Patchwork Revival. Okay, so this is going to be a two-part episode about the general sort of bird's eye view of the history of quilting in America and how we have come together as quilters throughout the history of what we know as quilting and sort of pass this tradition and this art form on to one another from generation to generation. So I have partnered with my friend Megan of the Quilt Scouts podcast, who is here with me. Hi, Megan.
Hi, Emily.
And we are going to split this episode into two parts. Like I said, the first part is going to be here on Patchwork Revival. And then you're going to have to go get to know Megan at the Quilt Scouts podcast to tune in to part two. We have been working on this for a little bit now. We're really excited to share with you guys. So I want to welcome any new listeners that might be here. Thanks for being here. As always, I just want to remind people to like the show, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you leave a review on both of our podcasts, we would love you so much because that's a way that the internet learns to share our shows with other people who might want to join in the quilting podcast listening community. So thank y'all for being here. Now I'm going to pop over. I want to introduce you to my friend Megan. So Megan, will you tell us a little bit about yourself, your podcast, Quilt Scouts, all the things? Let's hear
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yes, my name is Megan. I run the Quilt Scouts community. We are a community of quilters where we treat quilting like an adventure and we earn badges while we do it. And then I also host the Quilt Scouts podcast where we talk about all sorts of things. A lot of them are badge related, specifically. So, one of the ideas that prompted this episode is we have a new badge that is the Quilt Historian badge, which encourages scouts to explore the history of quilting, maybe research a historical quilt block or research maybe a historic family heirloom quilt. And this episode specifically, like you said, we're talking about the history of quilting through America, how we have gathered and learned through the decades and the centuries of quilting in the States. I am certainly not a historian by any means, but I am a huge nerd when it comes to history. I love learning about just history in general. Like I'm the person when we take a vacation, like I can't just like sit back and relax. Like I'm gonna read about the place that we're at, or read about the historic building that we're staying in. You know, we take a hike and I'm the one that's gonna stop and like read all the trail signs and like learn about things while my 5-year-old rolls his eyes at me while I'm like trying to teach him things. That's neither here nor there. But that's me. I'm a nerd through and through. But I have certainly learned that there's so much I don't know about the history of quilting. So this has been a fun topic for me to research, even if it's just surface level. I feel like I've learned so much. But like I said, the more I've learned, the more I've realized how much I don't know. So I'm excited to dive in and learn more.
Yeah. So that's always my sort of contextual disclaimer that I offer listeners is that I'm not a professional. I'm just It's like a little passion project I have.
Yeah.
History is important, I think, for many reasons, and I enjoy learning about it. I do think that it's always important to remember that while quilting is not a uniquely feminine endeavor, historically, women were doing women's work in the home, and that
Mhm.
meant sewing, mending, kind of our stereotypical things, while men were off doing what men did. And men often wrote history. And so I think a lot of times when we look at the history of quilting or other craft, I almost think of it as an oral history that's been passed to us from our mom's mom, passed it to them, and they passed it to us, and on and on and on it went. Of course, now we have the internet. So, I like to imagine quilting in this day and age is going to leave such a different mark than, back from, whatever, the
Absolutely.
Mayflower
Yeah.
or
Much better
whatever the mythical
documented than today.
start of, the United States was. So I just like to also remember that from that context is
Mhm.
that there's a reason, and probably a valid reason, that there is a lot that we don't know. There are people who have been really great resources for me when I look at sort of the history of quilting, and I'll link those in the show notes, and I'll share them with you too if you want to link for part 2.
Yeah.
But I really like looking at Mary Fawn's. She is on YouTube and she has a sort of hour-long kind of lecture, and she does a lot of quilt history stuff. I think she did some sort of studying through maybe the International Quilt Museum, which is also like a go-to reference. I
Oh,
know for,
fantastic resource.
yeah, for both of us, it's great. So I think that's all sort of the context I wanted to kind of lay before we dive into everything. Does that sound like we covered
Yeah,
where we're starting from at
I think so.
least? Okay, cool. So let's go back in time to, I don't know, where should we start with American history? I mean, I think of the, sort of, we know the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock. And so we have our kind of first colonizers, I guess, of
Mhm.
America or the United States as we know it today.
Mhm.
I'm not sure there's just a whole lot that I can, like, of light I can shine on this era. I think this has been an area of history in general that has been totally romanticized, kind of glossed over.
Absolutely.
I know that we think of our ancestors sort of exploring and settling in this country as like sitting by candlelight or firelight, in a blizzard, locked in their, whatever lean-to shanty, like stitching up patchwork quilts. But from everything I've read, that's just not what happened. It's
Yeah.
really not.
Yeah.
For several reasons that, I mean, fabric had to be brought over from,
Yeah.
yeah,
We didn't
different
have any
countries.
fabric mills here at the very start. So, I mean, everything that fabric and textiles had to be imported, which made it expensive for the average,
Yeah,
homeowner, quilter.
incredibly expensive and just scarce. I mean, I don't know. I'm just imagining too, like, things getting damaged on these ships that were,
Oh, yeah.
rolling across the ocean and sinking and all the things. So, but as far as quilting itself, meaning stitching layers of fabric together.
Mhm.
I have read before, okay, so that art goes back to, medieval times and even before that in all
Oh, yeah,
different
ancient
countries.
times, yeah.
Kinda like underclothing, like under armor, men would have vests and whatnot that were quilted garments.
Mhm. It was more of just like a textile technique rather than like we're talking about quilting versus patchwork, right? So, like,
Right.
quilting as a technique has been around for centuries. Like, you're talking about, like, bedding, armor, insulated clothing, things like that. It was more of a functional use rather than like a decorative use, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah. So
Mhm.
that's been
For
around
sure.
forever.
Yeah. And I've read before that there was some idea that there were, kind of Dutch settlers and other settlers who came eventually over to North America, to the colonies,
Mhm.
and they kind of brought that technique with them. Because I can imagine, you know, people who had armor and who needed quilted undergarments, for example, let's just say. I mean, that's a pretty small subset of even the population just at the time. And
Yeah.
so I'm imagining there was probably like a particular kind of seamstress or tailor who made those. Like, I don't necessarily imagine it being a widespread skill that like everybody who picked up a needle
I
had.
imagine it was like more of an apprenticeship, like you would
That's what
learn
I think
on
too.
the job how to make these specific types of garments or armor or whatever, quilted textiles, right?
Mhm. So ultimately, somebody brought that knowledge over to, the new colonies, the new world, whatever. And everything I know from just reading about it, essentially, if there was any kind of quilted bed cover, which is what, we're kind of focusing in on when we think
Yeah.
of quilts, those were for rich people.
Yeah.
I mean, they brought them over. Typically, they were whole cloth quilts. And I think it was more meant to show status. They were kind of status symbols. So I can't really say they were widespread or that people were like, oh, I better make that or whatever. It was like, oh, well, these,
Mhm.
rich landowners or whatever, maybe their wives had them in their homes, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I know that I think that kind of evolved eventually into there were some people who kind of would try to make kind of the whole cloth quilted items a little
Mhm.
bit more custom, and maybe they would get their hands on, like, a floral print or something, and
Mhm.
that was I've seen pictures of these, and you probably have too, where they would basically just fussy cut out, like, a very ornate bird or, like, a chancy, like, flower or something, and kind of applique those onto parts of a whole cloth quilt, so they would
Yeah.
have a little bit of a kinda zhuzh 'em up, have a little bit of a custom kind of feel.
Yeah. It's almost like early, I don't wanna say patchwork because you weren't piecing it together, but that early style of having different materials pieced together, but more like applique, so like a simplified design over whole cloth quilting, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, and then sort of I always think of that, I'm like, well, that's kind of the first probably idea where people were like, "Well, you know, I wanna make my house a home, and here's some way I could do some decorating," or
Mhm.
kind of have some sort of, yeah, I have to sit and do handwork or needlework because I'm a fancy lady and this is what I'm supposed to do or whatever. And so I'm gonna do this. So that's kind of a technique that I think we can look back on. I feel like what we want to do is romanticize it into this like kind of salt of the earth, use what you have, really scrappy survival kind of thing. And
Mhm.
it just wasn't. It's
Yeah.
very disappointing.
Well,
But
it's funny you say that because I was talking to Carolyn Ducey. She works at the International Quilt Museum. I did a whole other podcast episode with her, but she was talking about specifically that, like, there's a lot of myths within quilting.
yes,
And that was one of them that she had mentioned was romanticizing colonial quilting, and it is not what we picture. And a lot of that stemmed from the bicentennial, where there was this like resurgence in quilting, and part of that resurgence was like romanticizing colonial quilting, right? So I think that's
yeah.
part of where that stemmed from. But yeah, what we picture isn't necessarily accurate or true to history.
Yeah. So there you have it. It's kind of boring. So we'll just move on to the next thing. I mean,
Moving on.
not boring, but let's continue on. And the next thing, kind of the next era that I picture is sort of the American Revolution,
Hmm.
which I would still call kind of colonial times.
Hmm. Well, and I
Moving on
think
from that.
at that period too, from what I was reading, quilting moved from being limited to wealthy families. It became a little bit more common because at this point we've finally established fabric mills in the US. So fabric became more available, it became more accessible and less expensive, which meant that more homemakers were able to make quilts. It became more affordable, so it became more common, right? Where before fabric was exclusively having to be imported into the US, which made it very expensive and very inaccessible to like the common homemaker.
Yeah. So that kind of takes us somewhat into the Industrial Revolution in a way. I think that was about very late 1700s into the beginning of the 1800s, kind
Hmm.
of around like the end of the revolution. And like you said, so that's when we start having sewing machines were
Yes.
invented. So they were invented actually way, way, way long before Singer like started mass producing essentially like a home sewing machine.
Yeah.
And like anything, I think they're very expensive when they start and then they kind of trickle down into homes and stuff like that. So
Hmm.
one thing I find really interesting too is to think about how a person living in, let's say, Philadelphia in 1820, wildly different experience than someone like settling Mississippi and Louisiana in 1820. Like they
Yeah.
had wildly different realities and things that were available to them. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
that's always an interesting thing too. Things I think these days just take off so quickly and we have all this technology and we know these things exist and we have factories and manufacturing all over and just ways to get things to people, information and goods. So really different. So you can imagine this stuff kind of starting in pockets and then kind of taking a while to like trickle out,
Um,
I
yes,
guess.
exactly. Disperse. Yeah, the idea is the technology, the materials become more available. Yeah, it's not limited to just those specific pocket areas, right? Metropolitan areas.
Hmm.
Do you want to talk about like quilting bees, like kind of more like the community of quilting and how that?
Yeah, because this is kind of part of what I think about historically, quilting bees were a community event. Like there was
Mhm.
a quilting, and that would mean someone would host this at their house and they would put up a quilt on a frame or multiple quilts on frames and invite people from the community, so their neighbors. Some things I've read were saying that it was really an honor to be invited to be in a quilting bee because that meant you like basically had the goods. Like you could quilt well enough to be invited because there's only so much room around a quilt, you know?
Mhm. That makes sense, yeah, and I mean, if you're going to take up space around a quilting frame, like, you better have the skills to back it up, right?
Yeah, like you better do it right. And so I kind of laugh because I'm like, dang, we've always been like comparing ourselves to other people.
This is
And
like the early quilt clicks, is that what was happening? Like, you
yeah,
had to be the it girl,
it
the
sounds
it
like
woman?
it. But it
I
was,
can only imagine them, like, gossiping too, like, "Did you see her quilting stitches were so uneven.
I
Do not
know,
invite her to the next quilting bee."
I know. Or a lot of times they were unified around a particular event. So, like a girl getting married, for example,
Yep.
or engaged, like announcing her engagement meant, kind of traditionally they would piece like 12 quilts as girls in anticipation, like put them in their trunk, kind of in anticipation of their, eventual marriage. And they would have a quilting when she announced her engagement or intent to be married. So then all her quilts would be quilted and ready for her to make her home.
Oh, I
Um,
like that, I didn't know that.
yeah. Well, I don't know if that's like everywhere, but that was one
Hmm.
thing I read. That was a pretty common kind of reason. So you can
Hmm.
imagine, oh, well, this person and that person, maybe they're next or whatever. So
Hmm.
I'm sure there was a lot of just community buzz kind of around a quilt.
I think for should we add some? I was just thinking for some historical context. So we're talking about a time when quilts were hand pieced and hand
Hmm.
quilted. So this was not machine work. So the purpose of a quilting bee was one, it was a social event. It was a chance for people to get around and talk, but also it was like a community. It was, the whole concept of many hands make light work, right?
Yeah.
It was like the concept of a barn raising. We're going to work together to get this quilt done because it took a lot of time and a lot of work to hand piece and hand quilt a quilt for someone.
Hmm.
So that was,
Yeah.
I guess, the overall idea of a quilting bee. But around that, it did become a social event as well. I mean,
Yeah.
much like a barn raising was also a social event where there was, food and drink and things like
Yeah.
that too. But
Harvest, like,
mhm,
working all together. And another thing is, women were raising the children.
mhm,
So the children who weren't old enough to be out with, their fathers learning what they needed to learn there were probably running around the house watching, grandma, mom, sisters quilt, and just kind of it just was kind of life.
mhm,
And they would learn to do it and probably want to learn to do it so
yeah.
that they could someday be invited to a quilting and that sort of stuff. So,
Yeah, and
and it
that's how
was
they learned. There wasn't classes, there weren't quilt guilds, there was just the home life, and you sat and you listened and you watched and you learned by being in a room with these other quilters, right?
Mhm, yeah, exactly. And of course, we're not quite there like on a historical timeline yet, but I even think about at this point, my grandmother, she was raised in like a very rural part of Texas as like a poor, basically they were quite poor. And she was like through the Great Depression even. And
Wow.
she even talks about quilting from her, childhood and young adulthood. She was like, this wasn't like something, I mean, we had to do it. We needed to keep ourselves warm. We needed a way. So it wasn't necessarily like I'm sitting here becoming a master quilter. It was like, look, I need these quilts
Yeah.
done because winter is coming. And so I'm going to invite all these people to get this stuff made and done. One
Mhm.
thing, you said the phrase, "Many hands make little work." I read about a quilt from somewhere in the early 1800s. It was a gigantic quilt. It was like 10 feet by 10 feet, which
Monster.
I mean, that's like 120 inches square, basically. And so I was like, well, why would they need a quilt that huge? Because, I mean, it was like really they came from a time where an entire family, like mom, dad, kids, maybe animals, I don't know, slept in the same bed
Yeah,
because that was how they kept warm.
that makes
And so
sense. Yeah.
so it was like they needed this huge blanket to cover the bed, but also to be able to cover the individual people in the bed.
A mound of people in the bed.
Yeah, as well. So I was like, "Dang." I mean, can you imagine hand quilting a quilt that big?
No, I
So
hand quilted a single block recently to learn hand quilting, and I was like, "That's enough. I'm gonna machine quilt the back of this."
yeah, it's wild, huh? So but they would get it done. So, that was kind of a community thing. And then another thing I think about, a really, what would you call it? Like a shining era in kind of the history of quilting was the Civil War era,
Mm,
which
yeah.
I'm going to say basically was like, let's just say 1840s ish, all the way through the end of the Civil War, which was like 1860s, I think. And during that time, I think part of the reason it's become so, what's the word? Maybe well known, in addition to like now we have Civil War reproduction fabrics. I think this was when the really distinctive kind of little calicos and stuff like that were becoming more popular. So now we see those in kind of historical quilts that have been
Mhm.
preserved. But also, there's a little bit more, you know, communities have gotten bigger, maybe blended with one another a little bit. I recently did an episode on the history of like activism in quilting. And so there were, very significant abolitionist movements just
Yeah.
woven through kind of the colonies or, the very early United States after
Yeah.
the Revolution. And there were group quilts that were being made by different women. A lot of Quaker women were pretty heavily involved in the abolitionist movement, and they would make quilts together as a group. So there's one that I referenced that I thought was so cool, and it's like an abolitionist cradle quilt. So it's like a baby size quilt. It's just
Okay.
sawtooth stars, and you can just Google it and see a picture of it, and you can see an example of like the fabrics from that era. It was all just like sawtooth star blocks that they kind of each pieced as a group and put it together, quilted it, and then raffled it. So somebody, as a fundraiser, they bought that quilt that a group of women had made to
Hmm.
make a statement, to kind of express
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
Um, so I feel like that's kind of one of the earliest examples that I know of a time when sort of like it's like documented, like that's documented as part of this anti-slavery fundraising fair that this community was having. And there were quilts and, pantry goods that people were selling to raise money. So that was
Hmm.
more than just like, oh, this is an oral history. I heard one time this happened. Like there's
Yeah.
more of a documented kind of just part of a bigger kind of
Yeah.
movement that
You're
quilts
talking about
were.
like so kind of the transition of quilting from a necessity, a functional item in the home, to more of a activist,
An extra thing, right?
what's the word I'm trying to think of? A vehicle of good, right? A vehicle of activism.
Mhm.
That transition.
And and something that, okay, well, if you're wealthy enough, you could buy a quilt from someone.
Yeah.
So, I think unfortunately too, this kind of goes back to who actually writes history. Uh,
Mhm.
I mean, through a lot of this time too, I there's a lot of thought that even, very rich or very wealthy women would actually have their enslaved people in their home making quilts for
Yeah.
them, and they would say that they made that quilt.
Yeah.
So who knows who all, there's
I
so
know.
many things like that that we'll never really know. But I think it's always just kind of that's just part of the context of sort of the time period that, we're talking about.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I learned a little bit about quilting from this era, was looking specifically at sort of women using them as kind of activist pieces, but they would
Mhm.
also sort of take that concept and use it to raffle a quilt for their church, to raise money or whatever, just different
Mhm.
causes. Maybe they were also raising money for the Red Cross organization, like during the war.
There's a war
Um,
going on. Yep.
yeah, big war, big
Mhm.
war.
So there's also women that are making quilts for soldiers, people fighting in the
Mhm.
war. I think there was also some men making quilts too at the camps, weren't they? Again, out of necessity, but there were male quilters at the time. I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that was also happening at this time period.
Possibly. I don't
Yeah.
know that much about that, honestly,
Yeah.
but women, I mean, men knew how to do these things. Like,
Yeah.
I remember reading about Scottish men could, like, knit. Like, that was just a common thing that they did. They knitted
Yeah.
their own things because, I mean, they needed them, and,
Yeah.
mom was busy knitting everybody else's stuff, so, like
I didn't know.
so,
I love it.
I don't think it's, like, far-fetched at all to
No,
imagine men had
no.
those skills, and they were away from home.
Yeah.
Who was
Yeah.
gonna do it?
Yeah, exactly. You have to know how to mend and make things to stay warm and yeah, and whatnot. But and then also I think around this period, going back to like the quilting bees or just quilting circles, right? This is where we're sharing news of what's happening. We're sharing ideas. We're organizing ourselves into groups, activist groups or whatever. But there's this, not only was it a social event, but it was a community hub where we learned from
Mhm.
each other and shared ideas and thoughts and things like that too. So it
For
wasn't
sure.
just, yeah, making a quilt, but
The
it was sharing ideas.
Yeah, the community kind of underlying all of it is always what fascinates me because
Mhm,
it's like, here we are using what we have to sort of support people physically, financially, even just emotionally, kind of come together to take care of each other, really,
mhm.
for
Okay,
the
so after the Civil War we move more into, I'm gonna say, the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah,
That
I
time
think
frame track?
that's all still kind of, like, going on in Europe and trickling over to the early United States, kind of all around the several decades, kind of in the background.
Mhm.
So, after the war, I mean, then we're kind of getting into late 1800s, early 1900s, and then we're starting to see even more just more accessible things
Yeah.
like fabrics, calicos, like cottons,
Well,
things
and
like
we have, just looking at my notes, we have the invention of the sewing machine happens in 1846. So that's a big pivot point because not only does that make sewing more accessible, it makes it faster. It just speeds things up, right? And I'm almost wondering too, and this is, I'm just thinking out loud, if that moves quilting from a group activity to more of a solo activity because you're able to do more on your own at a sewing machine. I don't know. Have you read anything up on that? I'm just kind of curious.
I don't know.
No?
For me, I think that makes sense, and I think the other thing that makes sense is, okay, you're quicker.
Hmm.
So, maybe you can get all of your mending and sewing of, say, dresses or whatnot that you need to get done, and
Hmm.
maybe you have a little bit of time, and you have some stuff from your, dresses and shirts and breeches that you made, and maybe you're like, "Oh, well, this is pure speculation, but I have always imagined that can be a way when you actually are like, "Oh, well, what can I do with this stuff?" Because you're still in this mindset of like, I mean, I think any of us who kind of knew our grandparents from sort of the pre-World War II era, I mean, you did not throw things away. Did you
No.
need it? No. Did you throw it away?
You?
Absolutely not.
Oh, no. My grandma was the one that was taking the sugar packets and the butter packets and the dinner
Yep.
rolls to the restaurant and putting them in the
Mhm.
purse to take home.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can kind of think, well, I have these things. I haven't always had these things. Now I do. What am I going to do with this?
Because
Um,
so now we have an excess of materials. Fabric is
mhm.
more prevalent. It's easier to come by. It's less expensive. We have a sewing machine that is now relatively common in the home. So you have excess materials, excess more time. I don't want to say excess time, but more time to do more things. And I feel like this is where maybe more patchwork starts to evolve because you
Yes.
have these leftover cuts of fabric from probably garments. And now what do we do with them? Right. And now
Yeah.
we start to see patchwork evolving in quilting.
Patchwork and patterns, right?
Yeah.
So, you kind of think about, okay, well, I'm some lady. I'm like, I got, a new baby coming. The kids don't fit in this bed anymore. I got to get them in their own bed. That means I got to make a quilt for them, get
Mhm.
whatever I can, lump it all together, slap something together where they can have, you know, a warm bed to sleep in.
Mhm. Yeah.
But then if you start thinking, I think this is when, so the early 1900s, like late 1800s, 1910s, 20s, I think are when we really start seeing published patterns
Mm.
becoming really common. And so I think that kind of coincides with what you're talking about with sort of the advent of the patchwork quilt. And I think this was also still something that you can imagine sort of the vein of community running through it because some things I've read have noted it really wasn't uncommon for multiple people's quilts to, in a particular region or area, to have similar fabrics in them because they
Yeah.
were probably sharing,
Yeah.
trading scraps and whatnot so that
Similar
they could
fabrics and
have
probably similar styles, like the same
similar,
quilting patterns and
yeah,
things like that.
similar patterns because they would share.
Yeah.
Um, there wasn't rotary cutters, any of that stuff, it was scissors. So
Mhm.
a lot of, if they needed diamonds or something, there were particular ways you could, like, fold square of fabric or something and cut it and then have like 8 identical diamonds or something. And a lot of times I think they used a template, like a paper template, and then they
Mhm.
probably passed that around or
Oh, the
whatever.
template for
So,
share within a
yeah.
community.
Mhm.
Oh, that's interesting to think about. I mean, that makes perfect sense. I've just never thought through that
I
process,
know.
how they would have done that. So they're
I always
sharing
think
patterns that way by sharing templates, sharing quilt blocks that they've made. So you have this evolution happening of quilt patterns being distributed more on a local level is kind of what we're talking about.
yeah, I would think more I'm still thinking of it as more of, like, almost oral history, like,
Yes.
"Oh, I'm at a quilting bee finishing this quilt, and I'm like, 'Oh, this pattern is so beautiful.' And, I have this sewing machine or I've gotten all this stuff done. I don't have to necessarily mend everything because now, you know, I have 3 dresses instead of this one that I'm like, you know, repairing all the time. And so maybe I can spend a little time making a pattern like this. "Susan, do you have the pattern? Can I get it from you?" That sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know, that's what I always imagine. I don't know, I try to imagine, like, if I was that person, what would I be thinking or whatever. Not that I know, but I have a
Going
good
back
bit of
in time. You know what
information.
I keep picturing, I don't know why, but Wayne's World. Did you ever watch Wayne's World? And they have like
Oh,
their public show and they're like "Doo-doo-doo-doo,
yeah.
doo-doo-doo-doo-doo," like going back in time.
Yeah, yeah, we're imagining that. Oh,
Oh,
man.
such work. Okay. So we're talking about pattern distribution, moving from like local small communities where we have, you can probably just trace that with like you said, similar colors, styles, fabrics being used within a small community, to now we're able to distribute patterns a little bit more broadly in magazines and newspapers and things
Mhm.
like that. So that starts to become a little bit more common, like early 1900s, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think too, this is kind of when after the Industrial Revolution, this is when consumerism became a thing because you were
Yeah.
actually somewhat able, to do it. You're like,
Mhm.
"Oh, well, I can buy that fabric, and there's 4 choices. Which one do I want? Which
Yeah.
one is stylish? Who's wearing" "Do I
Yeah.
wanna be like all the other ladies, or do I wanna make a statement?" And so I feel like you kind of can see how it could have developed into more of a sort of art in a way for
Or like
women, and
element fashions more so.
yeah, and so it
Yeah.
was, they started this is when we have people like, Nancy Cabot,
Yeah.
these are like all these pseudonyms, they're like publishing in periodicals,
Mhm.
patterns, articles, all that kind of stuff, and people
Laura
were
Wheeler,
even
I feel like is one, right? I was trying to think of other
who was
names.
it?
Laura Wheeler, I feel like is one that I kept
Yeah,
coming up
and
with,
then there's a
like another
Ruby,
pseudonym.
n what is her name? Ruby, something, I can't remember, but
Ruby
yes.
McKenna.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so those are all starting to become more just part of life. Yeah,
So we start to
I'm
see printed patterns in, like we said, newspapers. We're talking about like Ladies' Home Journal. What's the Farmers?
like the Farmer's Almanac kind
Thank
of
you,
thing.
Farmers
Yeah,
Almanac. So these like printed quilt patterns are being distributed through print media. Is where we
yeah,
finally start to see
and that
this.
was what
So
and it widespread stuff too.
yeah.
And then there were also women, like entrepreneurial, enterprising women who were, writing, sharing patterns, but they would also share kits. They would share quilt kits at times.
Really? I didn't realize that was
Yeah.
a thing. I feel like that was, I always think of that as being more of a modern thing, but this was happening early 1900s. Quilt kits.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit, kinda after
Okay.
probably, like,
1930s, 40s.
1900s, before 1930, though, like, it was a business that some women were able to sort of have to care for themselves and their families and stuff
Yeah.
like that. So that's always very interesting, right? But
Interesting.
there were women out there just using their skills and their know-how and their kind of intrepid spirit to kind of make a career and a business
Mhm.
out of that. And I feel like that's a very to me, that's when I picture it being like a very romanticized time in history. We're like together, kind of in community, rebuilding after this devastating wartime.
Mhm. After World War I, we're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, I'm even thinking too post-Civil War when
Yeah.
we're like just, and it becomes just a practice in a way that you can kind of actually be creative because you have the luxury of ability and maybe some time and
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So do you feel like you
Do you
wanna
think this is a
transition from this to part 2? Because we're in,
Yeah,
like,
I
the
think
1930s? Okay.
yeah, I think that would be good.
Okay.
So from here, we're kind of transitioning into the 1920s, 1930s, and this is where we're going to also transition over to the Quilt Scouts podcast. So you can catch part 2 of this episode on the Quilt Scouts podcast. I'll link it below in the show notes for you. Don't forget, subscribe, follow, like the show, and then hop over to Quilt Scouts, where we're going to continue on with our discussion of quilting from the 1930s, 20s, and 30s through today. So we'll
Present
see you
day.
over there. Well, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilty. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. Also, be sure to jump down to the show notes to find links for this episode, as well as the link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. Remember that the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the connection made in the quilts we love. I'll see you next time.